Once upon a time, the entire human population lived on a single island. It was a small island and fairly flat, with sheer cliffs on all sides dropping thousands of feet to the ocean below. There were other islands, some fairly close by, though they may as well have been across the wide ocean, for humanity at this time lacked the means of scaling the steep cliffs or the technology to fly between them. At the very prow of the island stood a gigantic tree. This one tree provided all the food the islanders needed, not in excess, just enough to keep them healthy throughout the years. As the island was small and their food supply finite, the human population remained steady. And then one day, a young man noticed that the great tree had grown so tall that it now surpassed the distance between their island and its nearest neighbor. If we cut it down in just the right way, he pointed out, we could bridge the distance between islands and walk across the trunk. This new idea caused an uproar, with the islanders split into factions, the goers and the stayers. The stayers were aghast at the idea of sacrificing their only source of sustenance for a mad quest that had never been tried before, while the goers pointed out that, 1, the neighbor island had 2 food-bearing trees growing on it, and 2, well, now that the idea had been breached, now that it was at least theoretically possible to leave the island, it had begun to feel just a little bit like a prison. And so the day came when the goers' sentiment won out, and all the islanders gathered to cut down the tree of life, first stripping it of all its fruit and uttering more than one prayer and apology for what was about to take place. Then the cutting began. It proved much easier than anyone anticipated. Many hands make short work, and the tree fell exactly where they'd planned. Then it was only a short but harrowing walk across the chasm of nothingness to their new domain, and just like that, the human race had doubled their living area and food supply. They ate heartily, and in the following spring, many women gave birth to twins. The population grew. The years passed, but something had changed. There were now effectively 2 groups of humans. The original goers lived on the new island, and the original stayers lived on the old island, only traversing the chasm for supplies. These were of course shared readily, for there was plenty for all. But something else was happening. The bridge between islands began to sag, and eventually it became obvious that the great tree was in imminent danger of collapsing into the chasm below. The stayers reluctantly emigrated across the wobbly trunk, to be met with an equally reluctant party of goers. There was not enough space on one island for everyone anymore, this delegation explained. Therefore, a project was underway to cut down one of the great fruit-bearing trees to reach a 3rd island, one with 2 of its own great trees. Then there would be more for everyone. Until then, however, the stayers were denied access to the trees themselves, and instead allotted a set amount of fruit per day. They protested to no avail. The tree was cut, and the goers left Island 2 for Island 3. And then the darndest thing happened. The stayers cut their end of the new bridge and sent it plummeting into the ocean. Now humanity was truly divided, half on one island with 1 tree, and half on another island with 2 trees. Years passed. The stayers remained stable in their new environment, which had been their goal all along. The goers' population, fueled by the excess food, grew until it threatened the island's carrying capacity. Then they cut down one of their trees, and the majority of the colony migrated to another island, this one boasting a staggering 3 fruit trees. But eventually the bridge collapsed again and the colony split. This pattern continued for generations, until the day came when there weren't any islands left to migrate to. When the population of the last 2 linked islands was so great that its trees and land area was not enough to support them anymore, they began to cast their eyes backwards at the islands behind them. It may have been a simple biological phenomenon, but the great fruit-bearing trees only ever grew on one side of these islands, and so traffic was effectively one way. But no matter how much these beleaguered descendants of the original goers shouted, semaphored, or screamed, nary a tree was felled for them in the spirit of humanitarian aid. Then they got mad. It was posited that a bridge could be fashioned another way. A tree was felled onto the island, and carpentry invented. Now a desperate frenzy of activity ensued as everyone had been reduced to half rations. There was also the ticking clock of the lone existing bridge. Once it was lost, their options dwindled accordingly. It was no small feat of engineering to build a bridge across a chasm without access to the far side, but build they did, only to have the entire structure mysteriously burned when they were mere meters from their goal. Then it was suggested that they needn't build a bridge at all. If they could somehow send a couple of people across without the neighbor islanders knowing, they could cut down a tree on their own. And so began the construction of a catapult, which required the felling of another fruit tree. It was a giant device, large enough to send 2 people and an axe across the Great Divide. They had, of course, no chance to test it, and when our first brave saboteurs were slung into the ether, they traveled farther than anyone could have anticipated. They flew above island after island, perched atop a jet stream like a tangible substance, and everywhere they looked it was the same. People were living out their little lives, content with what they had and not a care about the great beyond. Then the jet stream angled downward, and our duo let out their fabrics, billowing in the winds to slow their descent. They tumbled to the ground in a heap, then sat up and looked around. They were on an unfamiliar island. Nobody was about. They stashed their wind fabrics and reconnoitered. After some time they came to the prow of the island, having seen not a soul, and here they found the first sign of prior habitation. It was a stump. Having no other options, they learned to live on that barren island. They drank dew off the grass tips in the mornings, and risked their lives descending down the cliff sides for bird eggs, and the occasional bird. They were joined eventually, in all nearly a quarter of the final 2 islands' population taking the catapult ride. Many hadn't been so lucky as to find land. Many had stayed. Some, they had to assume, had made it to other islands as planned. Somewhere out there their brothers and sisters, their cousins and mothers and fathers and children, had landed in the pocket utopias they'd spied on their mad dash through the air. What had become of them? Had they followed through with their orders and cut down a tree on every island, connecting the archipelago for either a human renaissance or a war? Or had they assimilated, joining the isolated islanders in their placid comfort? It was of no import to them. They were on the original island at the source. No tree could be felled in their direction. And yet, one of the catapulted humans hadn't been so sure of the plan. What if they landed and had to hide? What if they couldn't reach the tree for some time? How would they eat? This resourceful person had brought a handful of fruit, and now, in a loving act of self-denial and personal sacrifice for the long-term good of the entire group, they planted 2 of them, one on each side of the stump. It would be years before they bore fruit, years of scarcity and just scraping by. Some of them would not see the day when they, or their children, were able to harvest and fill their bellies from the fruits of these trees, and it was a certainty that neither they nor their descendants for generations to come would be among the people who watched the great trees span and then outgrow the distance between their island and its neighbor, the people who would have to make the decision on whether they should stay or they should go.